Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the second lecture of the series on the impact of CO on older adults. My name is Beth Cheshire, and I'm going to be presenting the findings of the research that I've been carrying out for the past 3.5 years at Lancaster University. Just before we start, I'd like to thank the CO Research Trust for the opportunity to present the research findings today and for funding and supporting the project. So this is an overview of the planned presentation. So today I'm going to be presenting both the cross-sectional and longitudinal findings from the research. But first, I'm just going to go through a brief background, followed by the research aims and the methods that we used, and then the results and research directions moving forward. So the majority of research studies severe acute CO poisoning, and the effects of these exposures are well described. However, studies on low-level exposure are limited, and any resulting effects are currently unknown. There has been a few experimental studies on acute low-level exposures, so durations up to 24 hours. And these studies have typically exposed individuals to around 100 parts per million for short durations, usually between 1 and 4 hours. So researchers would put participants into a chamber filled with low-level CO, or have them breathe the CO through a face mask, and then get them to carry out some form of cognitive testing. And what these studies have revealed are that small increases in carboxyhemoglobin levels, up to around 5%, are associated with cognitive deficits, such as impaired tracking ability and divided attention. However, as you can see from the pictures, these studies are very old, with the majority carried out over 4 decades ago. Other acute experimental studies have reported no effects of these exposures, so the literature is also somewhat inconsistent. So moving on to chronic exposure, there are numerous case reports within the literature that typically describe an individual's exposure experience. However, one in particular was a case series that followed 7 individuals who were exposed to CO within the home from malfunctioning domestic appliances. And the exposure periods ranged from 3 weeks to 3 years in duration. And what they reported were consistent symptoms in all 7 individuals, including headaches and nausea. Affective disorders were also high, including depression and anxiety. And neuropsychological testing revealed memory impairments and motor slowing in all 7 individuals as well. Now, follow-up testing revealed improvements in some symptoms and in cognitive functioning, with some patients making a full recovery. However, mild deficits such as slow processing speed remained in some cases, and symptoms such as psychiatric problems commonly persisted. So the effects associated with chronic exposures may be persistent in nature rather than short-lasting. In some cases, complete recovery is achieved. However, symptoms and cognitive impairments can remain, and these can range in severity from mild to severe. So these deficits can prevent individuals from making a full recovery. So they do contribute to significant morbidity. And they shouldn't be overlooked, as they can significantly impact the lives of patients and families longer term. So epidemiology studies also provide evidence of the effects associated with chronic exposures, with reported associations between air pollution and increased risk of stroke, myocardial infarction, and heart failure. And this is indicated by increased hospital admission and mortality rates in areas of higher pollution. An association between increased dementia development risk and CO has also been reported, and air pollution has recently been identified as a dementia development risk factor in later life. So taken together, the results of these studies suggest that neuropsychological deficits may present following these less severe exposures, and that they also may be persistent in nature. So we know that certain groups within the population may be at a higher risk of CO exposure. The research I've been carrying out has studied an older adult sample. As we know, as a group, they may be more susceptible to CO. So poisoning in severity not only depends on environmental factors such as the duration and concentration, but also human factors as well, such as pre-existing disease. So individuals with, for example, cardiac conditions or respiratory conditions such as COPD are likely to be more susceptible to raised carboxyhemoglobin levels and develop severe toxicity from lower concentrations. And this is due to the already compromised ability to adequately regulate and maintain oxygen supply. So the carboxyhemoglobin level at which more severe symptoms become apparent is dependent upon the individual's ability to compensate for the decrease in oxygen carrying capacity of blood. So the very young and older adults are at the highest risk of accidental CO exposure, and older adults as a group may also be more susceptible to the effects of CO, not only due to pre-existing disease, but also reduced physiological reserve. They also may be at a high risk from exposure within the home, as they're likely to spend more time at home due to retirement or restricted mobility, and they may also be housebound. So moving on to CO levels within the home, there has been a few studies that have measured the ambient CO concentrations within UK homes. And what they've reported is that in some of the homes, the ambient CO levels exceeded those recommended to be safe by the World Health Organization. And two of these studies in particular found that of the 326 monitored homes, 19% had levels exceeding the 8-hour guideline of 9 parts per million. And the elevated levels were frequently associated with gas appliances. So this may be a particular concern within the UK, as gas appliances are widely used for heating and cooking, and homes are often older and therefore they're more likely to contain dated appliances. However, other studies monitoring CO levels have found no evidence of raised concentrations. So again, the literature is somewhat inconsistent. But nevertheless, the results of these studies taken together suggest that a percentage of the population may be at risk from low-level exposures at higher levels than those recommended to be safe. So this could be having a detrimental effect on health. Individuals also might be unaware of the exposure, and this leads to your chronic prolonged exposures. But currently it is unclear as to whether these exposures can cause short-term or have long-lasting effects on the brain. So further research in this area is needed. So the research was developed from initial concerns from the fire service, who often report high levels of confusion in older adults who may be at risk of CO exposure at levels not sufficient to trigger a CO alarm, but that could still be harmful to health. So it's possible that these exposures may therefore be an unidentified cause of cognitive impairment that improved identification and awareness could prevent. So the research examined the proportion of older adult homes in Coventry that had low-level CO in the air and the resulting neuropsychological effects. Follow-up testing was also carried out at 7 months, and this was to enable the examination of both the short-term and longer-term impacts of these exposures on cognitive function and health. And additionally, the relationship between CO exposure and age on neuropsychological function was explored. So this is an overview of how the participants were recruited onto the study and the overall procedure. So the fire service invited residents who were aged 60 and above to take part in the study during their routine safe and well visits. Those who indicated that they were interested were then revisited by the fire service, and this was the point at which the data loggers and alarms were put in place. The fire service also carried out the first phase of a 2-stage consent process, where residents agreed for their details to be shared with and to be contacted by the researcher. Home visits were then scheduled, where full written consent and neuropsychological testing was carried out. And then the fire service collected the data loggers after 1 month, checked the files for safety, and then shared them, and I combined them with the health data ready for analysis. And this process was then repeated at the 7-month follow-up. So we collected a lot of information, including general information relating to the property type, the appliances and behaviour within the home, but also health data, including physical and psychiatric diagnoses. Levels of CO in exhaled breath were also taken, and a range of neuropsychological assessments were carried out, examining different types of memory, attention and executive functioning. Affective disorders, including anxiety and depression, were also examined. So one of the main aspects of the research was to develop a CO outcome measure that could be used in the analysis with the neuropsychological data. So usually you would use a measure of central tendency, such as the mean. However, many of the properties had a large number of 0 readings, and so the mean for many of these properties was around 0. However, the graphical representation of the data presented a different picture. So I've included the CO readings from 2 of the properties, and we can see that figure 1 shows a continuous extremely low level exposure, with the majority of readings over the month between 0.5 and 2.5 parts per million, with very few 0 readings, whereas figure 2 shows a completely different exposure pattern, with the majority of readings at 0, but then with these short lasting high peaks. So using a measure such as the mean was not an accurate representation of the data, so we needed to develop a measure that could analyse the different exposure levels separately. So firstly, ranges were developed, and these were based both on the range within the collected data and the World Health Organization guidelines. As the highest peak in the data was 29 parts per million, the 2 lowest guidelines were focused on of 6 and 9 parts per million, with lower ranges also incorporated to include the lower CO readings. So many CO measures were then developed and considered, with a percentage of readings between specified ranges chosen for the analysis. And this was because it showed the most reliable results and also permitted the inclusion of 0 readings into the analysis. So over the 4 weeks, there was a total of around 8,000 readings, and of these, the amount that fell within each CO range was calculated and converted to a percentage, and then each CO range was analysed separately. And it was anticipated that this data analysis method, combined with detailed neuropsychological data, would not only provide evidence of the effects of chronic exposure, but importantly, contribute towards determining the thresholds that detrimental effects occur. So of the total 106 homes, 70 had some CO present over the initial 1-month monitoring period. So the data was analysed using regression models. So firstly, factors that are known to affect cognition, such as age, premorbid IQ, pre-existing physical diagnoses. These were firstly controlled for, so that the levels of variance associated with these factors was accounted for. The percentages of CO were then added to the model in order to determine whether the exposure to CO contributed towards the explained variance. The results revealed that chronic exposure to extremely low level CO may be associated with slightly higher performance on a range of cognitive tasks, including auditory and visual working memory, memory recognition, selective attention, visual spatial ability and planning and problem solving. So these exposures appear to have slightly positive effects on cognition. It is important to note that the CO levels within the data were extremely low, with the mean CO level of 0.09 parts per million, and the resulting carboxyhemoglobin levels of the participants at 0.7%. So they were extremely low. So why would these exposures be having a potentially positive effect on cognition? So the beneficial effects of endogenous CO have long been described in the literature. So we do produce small amounts of CO from normal physiological processes, So when the body breaks down red blood cells, CO results as a byproduct. It has been identified as a neurotransmitter and is involved in various cellular functions such as vasodilation and proliferation. So it plays a vital role in cellular maintenance, protection, and survival. Now, due to its physiologic and cytoprotective properties, the administration of low-level CO for neuroprotection is being explored for therapeutic use, and it may benefit patients with traumatic brain injury, stroke, or epilepsy. So the view of CO and its effects on the central nervous system have typically been negative. However, endogenous CO is crucial for normal brain function, yet it is also so potentially toxic, and this is dependent upon the dose and duration. So these physiological processes, combined with adaptation, tolerance, and compensatory mechanisms, potentially minimize risk to the central nervous system under low-level chronic exposure conditions, so playing a protective or even beneficial role up to a certain dose and duration. For example, endogenous CO plays a role in the regulation of vascular tone in resistant vessels, acting as a vasodilator in cerebral and systemic circulations. So the vasoactive properties of CO may also result from exposure to low-level inhaled CO, which may play a protective role to cognitive functioning by temporarily increasing and maintaining cerebral blood flow. And this may be of particular benefit to older adults due to the vascular and cerebral changes associated with aging, but also to ischemic sensitive brain areas such as the hippocampus, the basal ganglia, prefrontal cortex, and cerebral white matter. These brain areas are associated with cognitive functions similar to the pattern of performance improvements reported, including working memory, memory recognition, and executive functioning. So the temporary increases in cerebral blood flow that may be associated with low-level CO exposure may explain the pattern of findings. So of the 106 participants that took part, 78 completed the follow-up at 7 months. And of the 78 homes, 47% had some CO present. So these results indicate over both studies a high prevalence of low-level CO within older adult homes in Coventry. However, the CO levels did not exceed those currently recommended to be safe by the World Health Organization in any home. So the results from the 1 month exposure at time 2 again revealed positive CO-related effects in areas of divided attention, processing speed, visual working memory, planning and problem solving, so across a range of cognitive abilities. Positive long-term effects were also related to the exposure at time 1 in areas of planning and problem solving at 7 months. Examination of the longer term impacts of the exposure from time 1 on neuropsychological function at 7 months also revealed negative exposure effects in areas of long-term memory, specifically recognition, reaction time, individual variability, selective attention, and near significant effects in short-term memory. Negative effects were also related to the exposure at time 2 as well, that in auditory working memory and cognitive flexibility and inhibition. So the total CO exposure over both time periods was also examined, and overall positive CO-related effects of the total exposure were observed in areas of visual working memory and planning and problem solving only. And overall negative effects of the total exposure were observed in areas of cognitive flexibility and inhibition, memory recognition, selective attention, reaction time, intra-individual variability, and near significance in auditory working memory. So the overall negative effects of the total exposure were observed across a much wider range of cognitive domains. And what we also found were that the remaining positive effects that were observed in the cross-sectional study in areas of memory recognition, selective attention, and working memory were not present at follow-up. Instead, negative CO-related effects in all three areas of these areas of condition were observed. So these findings suggest that the beneficial effects of exposure on memory recognition, auditory working memory, and selective attention are short-lasting and ultimately lead to impairments given either sufficient exposure time or time post-exposure. So memory recognition and selective attention were negatively affected by the exposure at time 1, suggesting that the initial beneficial effects resulted in detrimental effects given sufficient time post-exposure, whereas auditory working memory was negatively impacted by the exposure at time 2. So this may suggest that auditory working memory is more vulnerable to exposure and is affected by shorter time periods post-exposure, or that this negative effect resulted from the accumulation of the exposures over both monitoring periods. So the results provide evidence for the beneficial and potentially short-lasting effects of low-level CO exposure on particular cognitive functions. So the most notable of these were the effects on visual spatial ability and problem solving, and planning and visual working memory. And further support of the positive effects in these areas is provided when the results of both the cross-sectional and longitudinal studies are considered together, with replication effects present in these areas. There was no negative effects observed across any of these areas either, which provides further support for the notion that these areas of cognition are related to overall positive effects with CO exposure. And furthermore, both visual working memory and planning and problem solving were positively associated with the total overall exposure. And this may suggest that certain areas of cognition may potentially benefit more from low-level exposure. However, the results also suggest that the longer-term impact of exposure to CO is associated with negative effects on cognitive function at 7 months. The most consistent findings were the negative impacts of exposure on memory recognition, reaction time, intra-individual variability, and selective attention. And additionally, the negative effects on auditory working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibition that were observed in the short term post-exposure at time 2. Positive exposure effects were not observed in any of these areas of cognition in any of the analysis, which further supports a negative effect of these functions. And additionally, when examined in relation to the total CO exposure, negative effects were present in all of these areas, indicating an overall detrimental impact of exposure on these functions. So there was a relatively consistent pattern of results whereby short-term positive effects were observed and longer-term negative, and that these negative effects may potentially follow the positive effects observed in the relatively short-term period post-exposure. So this further supports the idea that particular areas of functioning may benefit more from and others most vulnerable to CO exposure. So interaction effects between the total CO exposure and age on cognitive function were also observed, and these revealed that the effect of age on cognitive flexibility, inhibition, processing speed, immediate and delayed memory recall, and recognition is potentially moderated by CO exposure. So the negative relationship between age and these areas of cognition was strengthened by the overall CO exposure when this was higher. And this was a relatively consistent finding across the CO ranges, where the effect was observed in the majority, through the majority of the ranges.